The Total War series, one of my personal favorites. It spans 13 games over 18 years, not to mention the thousands of years the games themselves have spanned. But the big question now arises, where do we go now? Or where does Total War go now? Remember when Total War games had the name of the game in front and then Total War after? Those are the good old days. We already know of at least 2 more games coming out. The Total War 3 Kingdoms, which is coming out in Q1 of 2019, which is springtime, and the third and final installation of the Warhammer Trilogy. Now, there's no date on that third and final Warhammer game, but we were promised 3, so eventually 3 will be delivered. But after these 2 games come out, where does Total War go after that? Do they make an updated version of an older game like they did for Rome, Medieval, and Shogun? Notice how I didn't say remake or remastered. That's because Total War doesn't really make remastered versions of games, not in the traditional sense anyhow. Most remasters are simply updated graphics and other minute changes to the game. Compare this to Rome 1 and Rome 2, which were released 9-ish years apart, and they are completely different games. Even the playable faction of Rome in both games compared to each other is completely different. As in Rome 1, there were 3 families to play as well as the SPQR, which was an unlockable faction unless you did some trickery in the coding. But in Rome 2, you play as Rome as a consolidated faction. The engine, the graphics, the politics eventually, and the gameplay are all different. So this wasn't a simple remaster, but something much more. If you're looking for a remake of Rome 1 at the moment, there's actually a mod for Rome 2 that changes the factions to what they were in Rome 1. I know that was a lengthy explanation of how Total War kind of does their remakes, and I put remakes in quotations, but the same can go for both Shogun and Medieval games. Both updated versions saw a lot of improvement in all facets. They weren't so much remakes as they were completely new games just set in the same time period. Now, both current Warhammer games and the eventual third are the exception and kind of break with the norm of Total War games that we've received in the past. Never before had CA developed and released the same series game twice in a row like this. With this, you may have expected both games to be more or less the same, but both games received pretty high acclaim and revived the franchise from the disappointing Rome 2 and the generally not well received Attila, although I kind of liked Attila a lot. So as I've said, where does CA go after 3 Kingdoms and Warhammer 3? Maybe to the more present perhaps? Total War Napoleon is their latest game by date at least, going all the way up to the 1815 date of Waterloo. However, warfare from this point on became more and more ranged combat than hand-to-hand. Both Empire and Napoleon, 2 games that have firearms at the forefront. Shogun does have firearms, but it's pretty well balanced. Both games met with pretty high scores and high sales. But what other period could you use this in? How far into the future could you go? Maybe a Total War game set in World War I? I really doubt it can be done, even for CA. The nature of Total War games are really individual armies meeting and battling at certain spots on the battlefield or towns or cities. The nature of combat in World War I were fronts spanning over hundreds and even thousands of miles. This was the case for the Western Front in Gallipoli. We also had trench warfare. How would CA do that? I know some people will mention that fronts like the Eastern Front and Middle East were more mobile, but how can CA rectify the other fronts, like the Western Front? Now, don't get me wrong, I would love to have a Total War game in World War I. That would be awesome. But I just don't see how they can be able to make this game without abandoning really the core of the Total War games in the Total War experience. It'd be very difficult for them to do. Okay, so we really can't go into the future anymore. Maybe a little bit, but not too much. So how about fantasy? Well, we've already seen CA break with tradition here and create fantasy Total War games, i.e. the Warhammer games. This opens up the door for other fantasy games as well. Some of the most popular mods on Attila and Rome 2 are in fact fantasy remakes. These include Game of Thrones and more famously Lord of the Rings. Like the Warhammer series, however, CA would have to be allowed the license to make said games using these names. Now the license would be the biggest obstacle in the way producing these games, in my opinion. Okay, so fantasy might be a ways off. How about another historical game? We haven't had that in a little bit, except for 3 Kingdoms coming out. But where do we go? Already 11 games, including Three Kingdoms, have been based on thousands of years of history. Maybe instead of a time period, it can be based on a character or characters, and you'll see where I'm going with this. Some of you may be saying CA wouldn't do this, but they already have, in fact, based a game off of characters, not so much a time period. Napoleon to the War was based off of the campaigns of the man himself. You could live throughout the different stages of the campaigns, which was another innovation of the series. You would have to go through them in order to unlock the next one. You would relive his accomplishments, follow the steps he took to take power as he did. The same could be said for a game released much earlier, the Alexander expansion for Rome 1, as well as the Age of Charlemagne DLC for Attila, Caesar and Gaul, Emperor Augustus, and Empire Divided DLC for Rome 2. All of these games and DLC were based solely around one or two characters. The newest game set to be released, Three Kingdoms, is much more about characters than a time period, although obviously the time period has to be during the lives of these characters. CA's put a huge emphasis on the characters of the Three Kingdoms, more than any other game to date. To me, this makes a further game based on a character rather than a time period more likely. An example of a game based around a character would be the character Otto von Bismarck. You could make a game centered around him and his many wars of German unification. Now, the warfare would be based around primarily guns and cannons and firearms, because it is still mid to late 19th century. But Napoleon, which is the last game to really be centered around those types of firearms, came out in 2010. So we're looking at least 10 years updated version of a game, Total War game with firearms, much like we saw with Rome and Rome 2. That was 9 years. So we can see a huge upgrade in graphics, in the engine and everything to kind of justify a new game centered around a type of warfare that we're already kind of used to. This is just speculation. That's just one idea that I had. Maybe a fantasy game universe I didn't mention. I don't really know that many. These are all speculations, of course, but I'm sure whatever period or universe CA eventually pick, they'll make it interesting and worth a look at least. Let me know what you guys think the next Total War installment will be, and also what you guys think of the new video format. I kind of like it. Anyways, thanks for watching, guys.